Hello, everyone. How are you doing, people? It's your boy Voodoo Viz in the house. I hope everyone is doing well. We are back with another live stream. I've got a very, very interesting guest, someone who I know personally before he became very famous on the front of every YouTube video, before he was on every single newspaper. I knew him back in university, went to the same university, and honestly, it's been amazing how seeing him progress and seeing him really become mainstream and sharing his opinions. I actually remember interviewing you. I think it was 4 years ago. I feel four,
Mm.
five, something 4 or 5 years ago, and you were just coming up. So I'm like, you know what? I better get in his good books now because when he's too famous, he won't even talk to me then. So I'm glad
Nah,
I
I'm
did. That was
not like that at all. I'm
I'm
not like
just
that at
messing.
all.
I'm just messing with you. But yes, it's my friend. He's my friend of mine. But he's an academic. He's a doctor. He's a race relations, social cohesion author. You name it, he's got it covered. Rakib Ehsan, how you doing, bro?
No, I'm doing well. I'm really pleased to be back on your show, and also you've done your fair share as well over the last 4 or 5 years, and I've really enjoyed seeing that development.
Well, well, listen, I've been becoming quote unquote famous with a lowercase f. Behaving like a clown, behaving like a clown on YouTube, which is very different to what you're doing. But to each their own. Everyone's got their own way of contributing,
Nah,
I guess.
listen, you're a natural entertainer. That's what I'd like to call it.
Tell that to my teachers in school. Didn't agree with you anyway. But anyway, yeah. So no, but it's been interesting. I think it's been really really great seeing you rise. You've been writing plenty of articles, going on many different talk
Mm.
shows, really contributing to the conversation. And honestly, you've just been a voice of sanity, a voice of rationality. I think you do represent a lot of people who are just normal people. They're kind of they don't want to politicize everything. They don't want to
Mm.
racialize everything, and you just say it as it is, old school fashion, very sensible but grounded in academia. And of course, you've written a book. But before we get into the book, I just want to do a quick shout out and a quick promo for a webinar coming up next week. Me and my wife Mimzy will be holding a webinar next week, and it will be around creating a new identity after leaving religion. I know a lot of people who watch this show have changed religion or left religion, or maybe they're trying to create a new identity for themselves. And it's been a journey that I've been on. My wife has been on. We'll be speaking about many different things on this webinar. So it's a free webinar. There's no harm in registering. The registration link is in the description. Registration is free and it'll be around an hour 90 minutes. It'll be quite interesting. Many tools you can use to create a new identity going forward. So please check that out in the description below.
That's a lovely photo of you. That one.
Thank you very much.
Very nice.
I think it's my first and last professional photo. This was back in the days when people used to go in the office regularly. So this was just before the pandemic. After taking this photo, I've lost some hair and I put on I think 20 kg of weight. That's what actually happened during the pandemic because obviously the gyms were shut. I had a
Mm.
baby. When you have a baby, you got a dad bod, all that kind of stuff. So this was my last good picture. So that's why I'm showing it to everyone. But thank you for noting.
No.
I appreciate that. I
I'm an
appreciate that.
observant man. I'm very
No, that's it.
observant.
Well, speaking of your observations, you've written a book which is really, really interesting. It's been doing the rounds, and I think actually it's very, very relevant
Mm.
to the conversation that's been happening in the last 5 years, probably even longer. And I think probably for
Mm.
the next 5 years, at least minimum, maybe even 10 years. I think this is a conversation that's been happening not only in the UK but obviously around the world. But I think you've got to focus mainly of all the politics and things that's happening in the UK.
Sure.
So it's called Beyond Grievance: What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. And I think, I don't want to say it for you, but in your own words, what would you say was the primary motivator for you to write this book? And what forced you to be like, I need to voice my opinion on this thing?
Well, firstly, as you know, traditionally I vote left. I'm from Luton, lived here pretty much all my life. It's a very traditional Labour voting town. One of the first things I did when I gained full-time employment was join a trade union, and I take great pride in paying my dues. So I sort of identify with the old-fashioned left, if you could call it that. And I think one of the main motivations behind writing the book was the fact that I really wanted to challenge some of the liberal left narratives, the modern liberal left narratives surrounding the life of ethnic and racial minorities more generally in the UK. One of the things I really wanted to challenge was the fact that even though this is dying down a bit now, thankfully, was this homogenizing ethnic minorities, treating them all the same, such as the BAME acronym, which is hopelessly reductive. So I think the big thing I wanted to do with the book was you flesh out those differences between ethnic and racial minorities,
Right.
and more generally, really challenge those theories which suggest that your racial identity plays an integral part in the shaping of your life trajectory, which is something that I disagree with. I think there's a
Mm.
variety of factors which shape life chances in modern Britain, and I don't think racial identity is actually one of them.
So could you break down the difference between old school left and liberal left? I know many people think
Mm,
like you say old school left is like, I don't know, working class,
mm,
patriotic, and
yeah.
then like
So
union,
community spirited as well,
community
in that sense.
spirited, right?
Yeah.
So firstly, the liberal left you could say is more like, are they demographically different and ideologically different, or just one or the other? Like, what's the main difference between old school and then like called new school, liberal, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, I think in terms of the modern liberal left, traditionally is quite highly educated. If I was talking about the modern liberal left, and that's where even though I'm fairly well educated, I don't really relate to many of their social values.
Mm,
Quite liberal views on issues such as immigration, integration, identity. I think that there's a bit of a patriotism problem as well,
mm,
in liberal left circles, where their view on British history, heritage, and traditions doesn't really match to mine. I have a generally positive view when it comes to Britain's role in the world and what it's contributed to the world over time. And I think in terms of what I consider to be important in life, I focus on the sort of bread and butter issues from a leftist perspective. So things like the cost of living crisis, workers' rights, employment protections, and also things such as healthcare. I think that over time, with the modern liberal left, they've almost developed this slavish fascination with American race politics. And I think much of that, unfortunately, has been imported into the UK. And I think something that we'll probably talk about in
yeah.
greater depth is the fact that the UK and the US are vastly different in terms of
Mm,
their histories surrounding race and their general social context. So I think that's one thing I really wanted to do with the book, is that if you want to cultivate a an uplifting and inclusive agenda based on equality of opportunity, social cohesion, respect for the rule of law, that's what you need to do in the UK. But you also have to end that slavish fascination with US identity politics, which has been imported in a very
yeah.
aggressive way.
Can I ask, because this is something which I find quite counterintuitive, and
Mm,
like I don't know what the explanation for it is, at least on the surface level. You said that like the difference between old school left and sort of liberal left or new
mm,
school, whatever you want to call them, is that the new school in general are more educated.
mm.
Now, what is it about getting educated that makes you come up with really bad conclusions? See, so normally, if you said to me, like, we've got one group of people here that are less
Mm,
educated, I won't say uneducated, but less educated, and then you have one group here that's more educated or highly educated, one would
mm.
think, oh, okay, I'll normally, the highly educated group of people would have more sensible conclusions, yet they seem to be doing things completely the wrong way. So, what's going on there?
Absolutely. For example, if you wanted to look at attitudes surrounding radical transgenderism, there's a very strong correlation with being highly formally educated. So I think that I think what's happened over time is that instead of valuing critical thought, increasingly there's been this kind of social activism has grown in British academia, which is hugely
Right.
problematic. And much of this activism is a grossly pseudo intellectual, in my view. It's not intellectually credible
So,
at
so would
all.
you say people who don't go to university have been insulated from indoctrination, and actually they're actually better off
I think in
using their
some
mind.
cases, yes. I think in some
Right.
cases, yes. I think that is actually a very good point that you've made there. Now, I'm educated up to PhD
I've done
level.
masters, you've done PhD, so we're
Uh,
pro-education in a sense.
yeah,
But
so I'm very pro-education, but
yeah,
I'm also very open to admitting if I do a piece of research and the findings contradict what my personal beliefs are, I'm willing to modify my personal beliefs based
mm,
on what the research is telling me. And I think that kind of openness, that degree of critical thought, is vital in terms of being pro-education. But I think that in recent times, many people have used their education as a way of just lecturing people
right,
on matters of justice and compassion. And I don't think it's really their place to do that.
interesting. And so you have this old school left, and then you have the
Mm,
new school left. Now they both on paper vote for Labour, let's say. But how do you think they interact in real life? Because this is back when Brexit happened, was sort of ongoing. I went to Brexit voters, the
mm,
Brexit, the pro-Brexit and the anti-Brexit protests or
mm.
rallies, whatever you want to call them,
Rallies, yeah.
and yeah, and the difference in demographic was stark. It was just you could see it, smell it, feel it. Like it was incredible. Yet you had old school leftists who were like, and usually more anti, sorry, pro Brexit, and then sort of new school liberal, very
Mm.
different. You could just see the wealth on their faces. You know, it's almost like they hadn't aged. It's because and I know I'm being very, very simplistic here, but it's almost like, but you could see it. You could see, I was like, oh damn, okay, this is real. Like this is a real thing, a real difference in upbringing and values and so on and so forth. How do they sit comfortably within the same party?
Well, I think that that was one of the main points that I made in Beyond Grievance. It's very difficult to reconcile the social values which are usually held by what we would term as a new leftist,
Mm,
um, versus an old leftist. And I think that in terms of demographics, of course, we've talked about the sort of different sort of educational levels, but there's also a kind of geographical difference that was
mm,
at play there. I think class definitely fed into it as well. But I think there's just a general view that being supportive of the EU was an indication of one's outward-looking nature, that
right.
it was associated with being tolerant, internationalist, when in reality the EU is a grossly protectionist bloc. And the point that I make in the book is that when you compare the UK to EU member states, major EU member states such as France, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, and Spain, I think I'd much rather be an ethnic, racial, and religious
Yeah,
minority in the
yeah.
UK than any of those countries.
No
So,
question, no question.
so I think there's, and once again, it's just you hear highly educated people, um, characterizing Britain as some kind of bigoted hellscape, the EU as some kind of
Mm.
oasis of tolerance, and much of this was simply not rooted in reality at all. So I just have to question their critical thinking skills and their
Yeah.
knowledge more generally.
So that's an interesting point. But I want to get into more your book. So, like
Sure.
you raised an interesting point. You said if I have a view, like whatever that is, the world is like X. But if you then do your research and it comes out the
Mm,
world is like Y, you're like, okay, I'd probably need to rethink my views and maybe I
absolutely,
need to change.
100%.
So when you were researching for this book, what things were you like, damn, like I didn't realize it was this way. Like I thought the world was this way, and now it's this way. Your research either changed your mind or sort of made you question your own views. What was like? Was it? Were there any moments like that? And of course, this will get into what you actually found. You know.
No, absolutely. I think when I wrote the book, even though it's very critical of the left, there are also elements of the book where I'm very critical of the right as well.
Mm,
And that's something that I'm sure that we'll talk about in
yep,
greater detail
absolutely.
as the conversation progresses. I think it's not so. For one thing, when I was doing research for the book is that I was alarmed by some of the statistics that I came across when I was doing the research. And I'll give you one example. So I was looking at by ethnic group, the percentage of children who live in lone parent households by ethnic group, um, across England and Wales. Now, if you're looking at children aged up to 16 years living in lone parent households, the rate for British Indian children is 6%. The corresponding figure for their peers of Black Caribbean origin is 63%. So
Wow, so
you're
tenfold.
basically, so
Right.
you're just, around
Mm,
2 in 3 children of Black Caribbean heritage are living in a lone parent household.
that's
That
incredible.
drops all the way to 6% for their peers of Indian origin. For the white British mainstream, it's around 1 in 5. It's 19%
20,
based on
okay.
the
Oh,
data,
90s, okay.
but back in 2019. And I think that really showed me, because I've always argued that the BAME acronym is absolutely hopeless.
Mm.
I couldn't stand it. But when you come
Just to
across,
go to slide, is it similar to LGBT? Almost like you're just
oh, yeah, it's just
clumping these things together.
you're just
Yeah.
you're putting together vastly different groups in terms of their economic performance, level of educational attainment, and also family structure as well. And a big thing that I talk about in the book is the importance of sort of family structure and household values in shaping youth development. So I think more than anything, it's just when you come across those kind of statistics, the one thing I was wondering to myself is how did we stick with these tied and simplistic orthodoxies for so long? I think
Mm,
that was the one thing that really came to mind. I think in terms of was it something that sort of remolded my general worldview? I think as I was writing the book, I always knew that I wasn't very fond of the modern left. That's why I wrote the book to begin with. But the more I was writing, I also felt that God, the British political right, there's a
mm,
very serious intellectual deficit there. There's no two ways about that. And I'm sure we'll talk about that as our discussion goes on, because I think the interesting contradiction is that some of the most conservative-minded, traditional-oriented voters are in ethnic and racial communities, and many of these voters, they wouldn't touch the Conservatives with a barge pole, if I'm being
mm.
absolute. They wouldn't touch the Tory party with a barge pole. And I think that if, for me, it's something that's a very big problem with the British political right more generally, that they're not trusted by some of the most conservative
No.
voters, authentically conservative voters in the country. So I think the one thing I'd say in terms of my worldview, how it might potentially shifted, was that in some ways I became more pessimistic about our politics more generally, not just on the left, but
Mm.
also on the right. I think there's a grave intellectual deficit which exists on both sides of the conventional political spectrum.
Right. Awesome. Now, just to get into this, you gave the example of, the differences in race. For example,
Mm,
two-parent households, 6% on one end, you've got, Indians, 6% of them are a single parent household. So like the
yeah,
overwhelming majority are not are in two-parent household.
indeed.
Then you got 60% or 63% for black children are in
Black
single,
Caribbeans.
Black Caribbean. Okay, so interesting. So is there a difference between Black Caribbeans and Black Africans?
Absolutely, some of the starkest differences. And firstly, I'd make the point that Black African category is richly diverse in itself. I mean, that could
Mm,
include established Christian migrants of Nigerian origin, or it could also include newly arrived refugees who
Somalia.
follow
Yeah.
Islam from Somalia, exactly,
Right. Right.
Horn of Africa.
Yes. Yes.
But if you look at educational outcomes, if you're looking at pupils in England, Black African origin pupils are actually doing better than the white British mainstream. Black
Mm,
Caribbean pupils are doing worse than the white
right.
British mainstream. So I think
So
there's
when we
very
say
clear
black
difference.
kids, even that,
Oh,
I mean, which
yeah,
ones?
exactly, and and
Above
and,
or
and
below white?
exactly, and those
Yeah.
patterns are replicated, for example, when it comes to schooling exclusions. Black Caribbeans
Mm,
are more likely to be excluded from school than the white British mainstream. Black Africans less so. So I think there's very clear differences there, and I think I'm sure you'll know as well that your average Black African family living in the UK, irrespective of the religious affiliation, faith has a greater
Oh, huge.
centrality in their
Yeah,
life. That's
huge.
simply not the case with with much of the Black Caribbean heritage population, which has become quite hyper integrated into the white working classes. And there's been that rapid process of secularization where a rising number of Black Caribbean people just say, I don't have a religion at all. That they don't
Mm.
identify with a particular faith. So, of course, that they technically share the same race, co-racial counterparts, but vastly different, especially in terms of cultural values, educational performance, and family structure as well.
Awesome. Now, the problem comes, I mean, actually, before I ask this question, were there any other differences in race, whether it's crime or educational achievement
Mm.
or average income that was um, quite noteworthy? You think, damn, like that's quite a disparity between these so-called BAME people.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's very real differences within the so-called South Asian community.
Mm,
There's no two ways about that. The Indian ethnic group traditionally is a very high performing group, educationally and socioeconomically, and it goes down to things like migratory background. As you know,
yeah,
many Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin families in the country, they originate from quite rural,
yeah.
deprived provinces like Azad Kashmir in Pakistan, Sylhet in Bangladesh. Indian migration is quite diverse in itself. That you had in the 1950s medical professionals originating from Gujarat entering the NHS, but then you also had the sort of East African Asians, East African Indians as well,
Mm,
who were expelled under the dictatorship of Idi Amin in Uganda, those aggressive processes of Africanization. But I think what it really shows is the Baymak acronym, the fact that it had such a it played such a prominent part in political discourse for so long is quite shocking, really, when you look at those disparities. And I make this point as well that the white population is not homogenous either in the
no,
UK.
of course not. Yeah.
There's diversity there as well. Interesting thing is that one of the fastest growing ethnic categories based on census data is the white other category, which would include Polish
Mm,
Catholics, Orthodox Romanians, and also people from Baltic states such as Lithuania. So one thing that's very clear is that we're becoming an extremely diverse society. And in terms of these sort of racial categories, Asian, Black, white, they really mask very real ethnic differences.
and I guess the problem, and you can speak to this more. Um, the problem comes when you either design a policy for
Mm.
black people or BAME people or Asian
Oh,
people,
absolutely, yeah.
and you've just said there's a huge difference in achievement or values or makeup or demographics
Mm.
or income and single parent household versus two parent household, and now someone's going to say, okay, this policy is for black people. Oh, which ones, right? Or this
Well,
is for Asian
yeah.
people. Which ones? You know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even within these ethnic groups, these individual ethnic groups, they're internally stratified by class as well. Indians are
Mm,
incredibly diverse in terms of religion. For example, you have
of
Hindus in
course.
Harrow, you have Goan Roman Catholics in Swindon, you have Indian Muslims in Blackburn, you have lots of Indian Sikhs in places like Wolverhampton and Coventry. So I think the key thing for me with social policy, we need to return to the bread and butter. Really, we need to be understanding how we can best support family stability. Because I think the one thing that's really holding back modern Britain, in my view, is growing forms of family fragility. We're an international hotspot when it comes to unformed families and family breakdown, along with the
Oh,
United
really?
States. It's 100%,
Okay,
absolutely,
that's interesting. So,
absolutely.
you're saying, so what does that mean with a hotspot for
Family
family break?
breakdown. So in terms of the rates when it comes to children living in lone parent households, incredibly high, along with the United States.
Wow.
Incredibly high. And I think something that doesn't get talked about very much is loneliness across the generations
Mm,
in the mainstream. There's certain communities, sort of traditional minded, ethnic minded communities, they're far more intergenerationally cohesive. And I think that's quite important for me because I think being connected to community elders, this is
yep.
my personal experience in Luton. and they've got a great deal of wisdom and knowledge that they can pass down. And I think that this is the beauty of living in a tight knit community.
Yes.
You have people that actually care about how you're doing in life. As I was growing up, as well as having such a wonderful family, wonderfully
Mm.
loving and supportive. Um, I also wanted to respect the family name in the community, which sort of spurred me on to do really well at school,
Yeah.
college, university, and then in my professional career. Because you want to represent the family name well in the local community. If people ask you how you're doing, with your exams, how you're doing in your job, you don't want to be the bringer of bad news
Of course
because
not.
you're
Yeah.
representing your family at the end of the day. So I think that family fragility, that loss of community spirit in much of the mainstream is something that we need to talk about a lot more, because obviously we are having lots of debates on integration, identity, and assimilation. I'm sure we'll talk about it in more detail, but I find it very simplistic. A lot of the arguments, people saying, "Oh,
Right.
you need to assimilate into British culture." Um,
It's like you need
what
to
you ask?
assimilate to your family first.
Well,
you,
well, I mean, what do you want
you,
me? Listen, in 2021, for the first time on record, since records began in 1845, the majority of babies in England and Wales were born out of wedlock.
wow, that's incredible.
Listen, you're not going to have the average British Muslim
That's
family integrating into that. They don't need to integrate into that.
uh,
Let's be absolutely honest. And I think the interesting thing with British Indians more generally is that I think that I say they've struck the sweet spot when it comes to
mm,
integration. They have a generally positive approach to integration. They've developed useful connections in the social and economic mainstream, which has allowed them to make headway academically and professionally. But there's been also forms of what I call sort of religious and cultural resistance. Keeping a bit of distance from certain features of mainstream culture. And the interesting thing is with British Indians, generally, they still marry within their own ethnic group and religious group as well. So they have a quite strong in-group preferences when it comes to marital choice. So they are positive in terms of integration, but when it really matters, when it comes to getting married, for example, community activities, quite often they're quite in group.
so can you explain to me what is it about Indians that their culture and values that has enabled them to find this sweet spot, which is they're academically, financially doing well, they
Mm.
integrate. There's no problems like, oh, we don't
Very
feel like
rare.
we don't. Very rare, and then at the same time they manage to preserve
Mm.
the essential parts of their culture, which is around
Yeah,
family and community.
exactly.
How?
Family
Like
community.
whatever. Like, imagine if you could put it in a bottle, and what would it say on the ingredients?
I think in terms of the ingredients, I think firstly, they certainly have a positive and optimistic view of Britain more
Mm,
generally, for sure. And I think much of it does, as I talked about earlier, much of it does go back to migratory background. Even though the East African Indians, they suffered a great deal being expelled from Uganda and also suffering a great deal of discrimination in Kenya. What they did have that they had a great deal of entrepreneurial spirit, that business knowledge, that business acumen. They brought that with them to the
mm.
UK. So they had that skills, that know-how, that strong sort of that enterprising spirit, which helped them a great deal in terms of integration. I also feel that English language skills count for a lot.
Yes.
Many Indian migrants, their English language proficiency was at a decent standard
Yeah.
upon entering the UK. So there's variety of factors that come into play. But I think they've struck that sweet spot, as I mentioned, having that positive approach to integration, but not becoming hyper integrated
Mm,
into, how do I say, the more undesirable features of
mm.
mainstream culture, which has become increasingly atomized, aggressively secularistic. And I think there's been a um, real decline in the respect for the institution of marriage more generally, uh,
Huge.
hugely. And I think the evidence is there that children who are born um, within wedlock, if you could call it that,
Yeah.
they're far less likely to witness their parents separating in their formative years than, say, if their parents cohabitate. So
Interesting.
they're technically romantically associated with one another, but not married. They're not
So
part of
even,
the
oh,
formal institution of
interesting. So
marriage.
you can break it down even further. So even if your
Breaking down in vote.
parents are in the same household, but they're not married, the less chance of actually.
More risk of parental
Ah,
separation in their
okay.
formative years, which can be a hugely traumatic
Oh,
experience for a
okay. I see.
child.
Okay. Right. 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 So when they're
Yeah,
16, their parents could separate because they're not married. Okay. Right.
yeah.
Interesting.
And don't get me wrong, I don't want to. I'm not. I don't want to overly romanticize marriage. Listen, there's sometimes you
Oh,
have
I'm
toxic
married. I'm sorry.
circumstances. Yeah,
Listen,
but
no, no, I'm
but but
happy. Before anyone
but yeah,
attacks me, okay?
but the thing with me being an academic,
Yeah.
you have to look at the patterns of association. Where are they
Mm,
the strongest, and what are the kind of family models, the sort of social structures which are most positively associated with youth development? And the
mm.
evidence is there to see. And I think the reason why many people don't want to engage with that is because they try to be overly inclusive. Oh, variety of family models work
See,
beautifully,
this is
and
this
all
is
the rest
where,
of it.
okay, you know what? Let's open this because now you've gone on to something else, and I think this is interesting now
Hmm.
because we've become so tolerant and accepting, which I
Too
think is
tolerant.
our strength. It's good to be tolerant and accepting, right? Okay,
Hmm.
fine. We don't want to discriminate against anyone.
No, of course.
Um, Sorry.
Of course, you don't want to
Yeah, of
discriminate.
course. Yeah, yeah,
Of course,
yeah. But at the same
absolutely.
time, the other side of tolerance is kind of saying just because we're different, all of our values or ways of life are equal in merit,
100%. You
and that's not
framed it
true.
beautifully. You
Yeah.
framed it beautifully. This idea that, for example, a variety of family structures are equally successful and
No,
productive when
no,
it comes to youth development. That's not
it's
correct.
not.
That's just nonsense. There's a wealth of studies which suggest the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same with lifestyles. But what's the interesting thing? There's a great deal of hypocrisy among the British political classes where you have these outwardly sort of liberal, virtue signaling politicians. Oh, live and let live. You know,
Mm.
just live your life, enjoy yourself, you know, and all the rest of it. But they live very socially conservative lives
Very
themselves.
exact.
You know, a lot of the things they're recommending, they wouldn't possibly
No,
recommend that for their own
no,
children.
absolutely
Many of
not.
these politicians, they were raised in a conventional family household.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
had their
absolutely.
own children after they got married as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, instead of saying, well, actually, this was really good for me. This upbringing was really positive for my own youth development. I decided to get married to the love of my life and raise children together because I felt that that was providing my
mm,
children with the strongest social safety net possible. They don't talk like that.
no.
They don't talk like that. And another problem we had was we don't have enough conservatives talking about it. But then if they're
I was
comfortable
just
with,
gonna say, I was just gonna say, it's all well and good the left saying whatever, but then you could say,
yeah,
what
of
about the
course.
right?
The right,
We know,
listen, the right makes Boris Johnson leader.
right,
Come
right.
on, listen. The man has a truly chaotic family and marital history.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
can't
exactly.
possibly implement a family centric
No,
social policy agenda with the likes of Boris Johnson at the helm.
no,
So I think you
absolutely
have
not.
a lot of conservatives to say, listen, we take family values very seriously. We take the institution of marriage as something that needs to be protected. It needs to be treasured. Then why on earth would you make someone like Boris
Mm,
Johnson leader of your parliament of your party?
yeah, yeah. No, it's surprising that they haven't gone for someone like Mog, so Jacob Rees-Mogg, who embodies the old
He
school
does. He does. He
Christian,
does.
religious, family, conservative.
And
I
you know what?
mean,
I think he's a
yeah,
fantastic speaker. I think he's
he
very
is. Yeah,
polite. I've come
yeah.
across him. He's never come across as
No,
truly rude or abrasive,
no.
anything like that. He tries to conduct conversations in good spirit and in good faith
Mm,
as well. Um,
absolutely.
so I think listen, I think that the Conservatives that there's a brutal defeat looming over the horizon, but they need to have a very serious period of introspection, and there has to be a great deal of soul searching in terms of what they truly stand for.
You know what? I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, but I feel like you're absolutely right. They do. You know what it is? It's like you want to see them because listen, they've been in charge for 14 years now. I remember we were just talking about it
Mm,
off air. They were
yeah,
elected with Clegg and Cameron in
yeah, the
2010
coalition.
coalition. We were in our
Yeah,
first year of university, I think it was. Just
yeah,
reversed
early
it.
stages of our
And
undergraduate studies.
right,
Yeah.
we were in undergraduate, and they were elected, and it was a big hoo-ha, all this kind of stuff. Coalition government. They've been in power since to 14 years, and they,
Mm,
as the Conservative government, for some reason, they keep failing on all these leftist things we keep talking about. So it would never happen under a conservative government. No, it's happened
It has.
massively under
Yeah.
conservative government. So I would want them to be defeated, but unfortunately, the opponent is so useless that they're not even capable of throwing a punch that would even hurt them.
Oh, listen,
You see
I,
what I'm
th- I
saying
think
here? So it's like you want them to lose, but to these guys,
you're not spoilt for choice being a British
no.
voter. That's absolutely clear. And I think the Conservatives, I think, okay, they've done some good education related reforms. That Michael Gove has been associated with. I think that's been a positive. But beyond that, I'm struggling to um, identify any of their achievements over the 14 years of Tory-led rule. I think it's very interesting. I think we could talk about this now. So, as we know, the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, wrote an
Yeah.
op-ed for The Telegraph, which essentially suggests that the Islamists, the Islamist extremists, are now in charge of Britain.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
And,
Yeah.
and we'll talk about that. But I think it's just absolutely remarkable that a former Conservative Home Secretary would admit that. I mean, that's a gross failure in conservative rule that after 14 years, what it's come to, well, in Britain, the Islamists are now in charge. So what you've been doing all this time?
This is this. So okay, let's get into this. So Suella Braverman, who has an interesting record or rather interesting public. She's quite an interesting public face because she was, I
Yeah,
believe, sacked by Rishi Sunak for her. Was
it
it
was.
was exactly, yes. What was it exactly again? What she was sacked over? I can't remember. Was it
It's
the
something along the lines
policing?
that it was a variety of things, but ultimately she wrote she wrote a controversial op-ed without Number 10's consent
Right, approval.
and
Okay.
go ahead. And in the op-ed, she made some ridiculous comments relating to Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland at that time, there was a political stalemate at Stormont. The power sharing arrangement had collapsed. So that was, I think, that was the main reason behind the
Right.
sacking.
But then also, I remember she made comments when it came to the Palestine-Israel march. So there's a two-tip something. I think it was her anyway.
Yeah,
Uh,
Twitter policing. She referred
yeah,
to them as hate marches.
right. All that kind of
Yeah,
stuff, and I guess she was to some people saying, "Oh, wow, she's actually, standing up for some. She's
yeah,
fighting back because I think her husband's
yeah,
Jewish or Israeli, something like that."
yeah. I believe
Nevertheless,
he's Jewish. I'm not sure about his
Jewish.
nationality.
Okay, so
Jewish, yeah.
maybe he's Jewish. But having
Yeah.
said that, yeah, fine. But the Conservatives have been in government for 40 years. You had an MP, David
Mm.
um, Amos, that was killed by
Sir David Emmis,
so
yeah,
they,
who
so
was
so
murdered in an
all of this
Islamist terrorist
happening,
attack in
right? So
Essex.
all of this is happening under your rule, and then you
Mm.
say, as if you had no part to play in this. These guys have come and they've taken.
Remarkable.
Okay, well, what have you been doing?
It's just remarkable, and I think it's. I'm glad you mentioned Sir David Emmis. I really do.
He doesn't
He
get
was a
spoken about nowhere near as much
long-standing
as he should have.
parliamentarian. He
Incredible.
was someone. He was very proud of his Roman Catholic faith, but he's actually a very good friend of Muslim communities in Southend,
Mm,
his neck of the woods. And I think what was remarkable that he was murdered at a constituency surgery in a church hall, and murdered in a brutal Islamist terror attack. People are talking about social media.
yeah.
They're talking about social media. But we've got this really nice online harms bill, as if this would prevent future Islamist terrorist attacks. I just think
Incredible.
what, and it's people within the Conservative Party speaking that way, and I think it's absolutely remarkable. That should have been a major wake up call for the country, and I don't
I mean
think
that.
that we
Yeah,
learned
right.
any lessons from it
That
at all.
was a potential flashpoint to be like, oh my god, now we've got
Mm,
to stop.
mm.
An MP has been killed in a church. In this, we have to now address the situation, push the brakes, or smash the brakes, and be okay. What the hell is going on? Instead, oh no, let's just talk about social media and all that kind of crap.
Yeah, the
Um,
toxicity of social media.
okay. I'm trying to understand why. Why has the Conservative
Cowardice,
government?
cowardice.
Okay.
Let's be absolutely clear. They're scared it might happen to them. But if you're that cowardly, you shouldn't be in politics. If
So,
I'm
so,
being
so I
absolutely
guess,
honest.
okay, I'm going to be play devil's advocate. Suella Braverman was right. So maybe shouldn't. Is it the fear of Islamist attack that's running the country? The fear. So,
I think there's a great deal of fear. I think one thing that she's absolutely right on. She talked about prevent, which is the government
mm,
sort of anti-terror
yeah,
scheme. which is really interesting because it basically it functions on a sort of referral system. People get referred if they're considered to be a radicalization risk, and the ideological composition of cases referred doesn't match the wider terror threat, where Islamist extremism is the principal terror threat. And the argument that I've made is that you have a lot of progressive leaning public bodies in education and healthcare, which are heavily involved in the referral system. And they might be fearful of referring Islamist radicalization cases for fear of being accused racist, Islamophobic. They might be accused of suppressing religious freedom as well.
Yeah.
And they're perhaps more comfortable with referring people who are considered to be far right radicalization risks.
Right. Right.
And there
So,
may
so
be
even
ideological
even that
biases there.
prevent thing has been misused. You would thought that would have been the one thing to
Well,
target.
it's not. I don't think it's not functioning very well in my
No.
book. There's been numerous failures, horrific failures associated with Prevent as well.
Mm.
So I think in that sense she's correct. I think there's a culture of fear and cowardice surrounding Islamist extremism. No two ways about that. She's right. But I think to say Islamists are in charge of Britain, that's a reach, and I'll explain why. Because if that was the case, I think the country would look vastly different. It would. I mean, we would be talking about Islamist control of the majority of democratic bodies in the country, schools and universities, police forces, the criminal justice system. And I think even though there are problems surrounding entryism, it's something that I've talked about, where you've had tribal ideologues worming their way into state bodies in positions of influence. I think to say that Islamist extremists are in charge of Britain is alarmist. It's alarmist and also sounds quite defeatist. It sounds a bit like,
Mm.
well, listen, the Islamists are in charge now. No, might as well just pack our bags and just call it a day. We've lost. And I think
Yeah.
I think it sends the wrong messaging, and that's why fundamentally I disagree with it.
Okay. So how do we? I mean, this sounds like a simple question, but an obvious answer. But I don't know if anyone's have the courage to do it. But how do we stop being scared? I know this is almost like, well,
Well, I think first we need to identify the problem. Both of us know that Islamist extremists, they're not some kind of monolithic block. They're actually incredibly diverse. They have a diversity of aims, objectives. They span different Islamic denominations as well. Um, we're not talking about some kind of nationally organized and ideologically cohesive movement. That's
mm,
not what Islamist extremists in the UK are. You could put five Islamist extremists in a room. They might find some common ground on some issues, but they'll probably
you're not
start
killing each other.
arguing. They'll start,
Yeah.
start arguing 15, 20 minutes, right?
Right. Right. Right.
And I think we need to get very serious about how it's a multi-dimensional threat. And the
Mm,
reality is Islamism, the prevailing forces of Islamism in one part of the country might be very different to another part of the country. So you need localized, targeted strategies. I think in terms of question, how do we stop being scared? Listen, we could a lot of this could have been prevented. In my view, we've had so
how?
many warning shots and so many wake up calls. Talked about Sir David Emmis. Well, I mean, firstly, I'll give you another example. So the prevent funding, sort of anti-terror funding, it's been found that some of this funding's been allocated to so-called charities where the leadership has appeared to express sympathies with the Taliban.
Are you serious?
Yeah, but and I think things like that. It's just the way our systems operate, and I think this is something I think we even talked about this at university actually back in the day. If you look at sort of the British model of community engagement, they usually engage with the very worst people in the
Mm.
communities, right? People who don't really have social cohesion at heart. I'd consider them to be tribal ideologues.
Is it like
Um,
citizen Khan, like I'm community leader and like the most
Well,
obnoxious person you could
they're
possibly
very
find?
rarely. These figures are very rarely held any kind of elected office.
Yeah,
They're
right.
not. There's no sense of accountability. No model of accountability at all. And actually, it's those more sort of moderate, patriotic, law-abiding, pro-democracy voices that get drowned out. They're
Mm.
sidelined. and because they're not as assertive and as aggressive.
Is
And
it
so
almost because the people they target are often a caricature of what they think that community looks like?
absolutely, absolutely. I can. There's a bigotry of low expectations at play. They actually
So,
think
and
that
you find the most
you have
ethnic,
some you
yeah,
have some
exotic looking creature.
incredibly witless so-called progressives who actually think this person is representative of British Muslim
Right,
communities.
right.
Actually, a lot of the research I've done, for example, shows that the majority of British Muslims are actually very appreciative of British democracy. They don't see themselves as victims. I think the victimhood industry is remarkable. The Islamophobia industry. The UK is arguably the greatest place to live if you're a Muslim. Right? Go to France, just go across the channel. You see how you're
Yeah.
treated there. I'll be absolutely honest. And I think the one thing I'd say though that those freedoms are not there to be exploited, but quite often in that model of community engagement, they engage with self-appointed community leaders who are very keen to exploit those freedoms. You give
Right.
them an inch, they'll take a mile.
Take a mile. And okay, I think it's quite interesting you mentioned that
Mm,
about Muslims having a favorable outlook towards democracy, because I think this was a lot of people might be surprised to hear that,
mm,
considering a vocal maybe minority often cry for Sharia or for some
mm.
version of theocracy and think, well,
Yeah,
that's
absolutely. Yeah.
opposite to democracy. So even I was kind of in preparation for this, I was kind of re-examining that view, and I thought, how many people, like for example, let's just come back to current events, like the whole Palestine marches and sort of
Mm.
whether you want to call them pro-Palestine or pro-Hamas, that's arguable because a lot of the sort of slogans, a lot of the posters we've seen. So I'm not saying everyone's pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas, but it seems to be
There
a
are worrying
real
elements of the protests.
worrying
There's
elements. Let's
worrying
put it that way.
elements.
How many of those people do you think shouting aggressive slogans from the roof would be pro-democratic, like or pro-British?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I think that in terms of the protests, it's very clear that there's been anti-Semitic chanting. There's no two ways about that. We've seen that. There's been the displaying of pro-terror paraphernalia as well, and there've been direct incitements to violence. How the police has failed to intervene a number of times is absolutely remarkable. No, there's clearly there'll be anti-British elements at the
Mm,
protests. There's no two ways about that. But you say there'll be anti-democracy elements, but I don't think that many of those people would actually want to live under Hamas. I'll
no,
be absolutely honest with you,
no,
which is
of
ultimately
course not.
it's a prescribed terrorist organization in the UK. Now, I'll be absolutely honest. I'm very passionate about, the cause of Palestinian statehood. Um, I think that when you're looking at the British political right, they talk a great deal about statehood, self-determination, national sovereignty, but then all of those concepts go out the window when it comes to talking about Palestine. And I think at times the British political establishment has struck a slavishly pro-Israel position, which I don't actually think is in the Britain's national interest. And I think the current Israeli government, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, it includes quite fanatical figures, far right figures in the government, such as Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben Gvir. So I think that the way the country has handled the whole Israel-Palestine issue um, has not been particularly sensible. But I think
Right.
in terms of the protests, there's no doubt about it. I think some of the things I've seen at the protests have been very troubling, and I think that the law and order response has been quite weak. And if you're talking about British Muslim communities generally, there's no doubt that there'll be elements who they don't have any affection for the UK. In fact, they might be quite hateful towards the UK and democracy more generally, but they stay. They still
Well,
stay.
I
So
think that you're absolutely right. But I think, how do I put this? There's a lot to unpack there, but it's almost like the new liberals or the sort of liberal elite that live conservative lives yet promote
mm,
you guys go have whatever you want to
yeah,
live, right? So although in their own communities they would never live like that, they would never have children outside of wedlock, or at least if they did, they would try and cover it up.
yeah, and there's a
But then,
similar dynamic here as well.
right, so
Yeah,
it's like I'm going to slate Britain or slate democracy or slate freedom of speech,
mm,
for example. That's another fault
absolutely, yeah,
line, right?
exactly. Freedom of
At the same
expression. Yeah,
time, am I going to leave? No. Am I going to use freedom
mm,
of speech in my favor? Absolutely.
Yeah,
Um,
very
so
selective.
very, and that's not just. So I'm trying. I raised that point because it's not just Muslims that are doing it. It's literally the liberals that
Many
do it.
people, yeah, many
Many
people
people
do.
do it.
Yeah.
So it's not just a Muslim problem, quote unquote Muslim problem. It's every human being. Of course, if you offered
Mm.
them more money and said, "Would you give me money?" No, of course not. They'll take it, but they wouldn't give it, right? So I guess
No, true.
our sort of the balance is sort of in striking the balance across people as fairly as possible. What fair is and what it looks like is obviously the debate itself. But
Mm.
just on that point, and I want to get into sort of the whole Palestine um, sort of, because this has almost been like this opened a wound or opens this
Mm.
Pandora's box, and all of these you could say problems have come to the fore. And when you were saying Hamas is terrorist, a lot of people, and I remember is it Dilly Hussein, he
Mm.
wouldn't categorize them as terrorists. Many
Yeah.
Muslims would not categorize them as
um,
terrorists.
the reality is in the UK that they're a prescribed terrorist organisation. I mean, that's what it boils down to. And if you have respect for the rule of law, you have to acknowledge when organisations are
Mm,
prescribed. That's the truth of it. Yeah, you recognise that when a neo-Nazi organisation is prescribed, Hamas is a prescribed terrorist organisation in the UK.
yeah,
I think for me, in terms of people talking about October 7th, maybe saying it's a sort of legitimate form of resistance, I think some of the things that have emerged from October the 7th, I don't consider them to be legitimate acts of
no.
resistance.
Well,
I'll
I
be happy
mean,
to.
it's made everything worse because now you've led to obviously Israeli deaths, but also Palestinian deaths, and
Oh,
that all could have been avoided if they had taken a different course of action. And so go on.
no, I mean, I think the worry is that the status quo is not sustainable, and I think in terms of the Middle East, you won't have a truly stable and peaceful region unless you get to the bottom of the Israeli-Palestinian
No, you
problem.
won't. No,
There's no two ways about that. One thing that's clear for me after October the 7th, Hamas cannot be possibly involved in any kind of peace
no.
settlement. I think that's very clear. But I tell you what, neither can Benjamin Netanyahu. He's not remotely interested in Palestinian state. I think personally, he takes a great deal of pride in the fact that he's been deeply obstructionist when it comes
Mm.
to any kind of conversation on Palestinian statehood and self-determination. So I think what you need a fundamental change in leadership in both Israel and Palestine. On both sides, you need significant changes to leadership, because at the moment, with the current actors in play, not remotely possible.
No. The problem is, one could argue it's possible in Israel to change leadership, but I mean, it's near impossible unless you. I guess this is it. How would you change the mass leadership? They're not going to have a vote all of a sudden, unless
Well,
they are
no.
militarily defeated. No one's going to change them. It's
Well,
impossible.
and I think that, the interesting thing is, I know that you're quite familiar with sort of Middle Eastern political traditions and all the rest of it. Palestinian politics traditionally is quite secular. It has quite
Yes.
secular. It's quite secular, relatively secular roots, I'd say, compared to other places in the Arab world. So I remain optimistic, but it requires a lot of change on both sides. It
Mm,
really does. But I think one thing that's clear after October 7th, it's very clear that Hamas can't be involved in any kind of peace settlement. It just can't after what happened. Um, and listen, I think that can't lose hope. A lot of people say, the two-state solution is dead. We're never going to have a peace. I think being that defeatist is actually quite dangerous, and it's not going to do anything for the region. But I also think that more of the Arab states, they need to be more involved. They need to have be more positively involved in the sort of discussions surrounding a potential peace settlement. One thing I'd say, we had this normalization, between Israel and Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates. There's
Saudi was
discussions
getting
on
warm. Saudi was
Saudi's
getting
getting
warm.
warm. Morocco was somewhat involved as
Yep.
well, and I think there's also normalization with Kosovo, which is a Muslim majority country. That's not the way to secure peace in the Middle East. I mean, that was never. I never believed in normalization being a way in terms of stabilizing the region.
Mm.
It was never going to work, and
So what do you
I
think?
think
So if they're not going to foster relations with other neighboring Muslim countries, what do you think is the way forward?
It would need the Israeli people to vote for a very different future. That's the truth. It need to be. You'd need a political party that was at least open to the idea of Palestinian statehood. That's for sure.
So can I push back on that? Because
Mm,
like, would you give, like, let's say that we had a left wing party or even a
yeah,
moderate centrist party, whatever, in Israel.
yeah.
I don't know if Hamas care if, oh, they're left wing Israelis rather than right
Hamas
wing.
can't be involved in but I'll make it very clear.
Oh, I see. Okay, just so all
Hamas
right.
cannot be involved in a peace settlement. I think
Okay,
that's absolutely clear as day. I think that the idea that you can have Palestinian statehood, well, Hamas is a critical actor in Gaza.
impossible. Yeah,
It's wishful thinking, especially after October the 7th. And I think the Lord thing that's missing, Hamas doesn't treat Palestinian people very well either.
no.
Let's be absolutely clear about that. So listen, I'm a very optimistic person. I still think that we can reach a successful two-state solution. I think it could be a three-state solution where Gaza and West Bank might be separate, independent nation states in their own right. Because to have an independent Palestine which is separated, I'm not that might be difficult in terms of working that into reality. So I think that there's a variety of options that need to be explored, but you need the right actors and you need positive international involvement in order to facilitate that. We're a long way away from that, but I don't think that we can give up on it.
Okay, fair enough. I'll just leave with this comment someone wrote here, and you can react to it if you want, which is the idea of the Middle East peace coming about by solving the Arab-Israeli conflict
Mm.
is a myth. The instability of the Middle East stems from the lack of proper imperial power dominating the region.
No, I don't think it's a myth. I think it's fairly obvious that much of the disruption in the Middle East is ultimately surrounds the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The idea that you'd have a grand imperial power and that would sort everything out, I don't buy into that at all, to be absolutely honest.
Right, fair enough. Now, we've spoken a lot about left,
Hmm.
about certain problems within um, that party or the new liberal way of thinking. Let's speak about the right because,
Hmm.
like we were saying before, they've been in power 14 years. Everything that we've discussed has happened under them. All the BLM, all the Palestine, all the things that you would associate with left has
Hmm.
happened under the right. Okay. So we've spoken about their cowardice, we've spoken about their weakness. Um, but is there a woke right emerging? Do you think there is a woke right? Like the same way the left overcorrects, and that's kind of like a woke, they're trying
Hmm.
to, like, their utopia is a woke world. No one is offended by anything, and every group is valid in every single way, and everything is is there a woke right version? What does that look like? Are we seeing some um seeds germinate? And I would argue how the right in America and the UK are
Hmm.
flirting with Putin. That's like hang on a second. I thought that those were the bad guys, and now because he's a strong Christian man who's willing to kill people. Now this is what. So it's almost happening on the other side, and not as bad, but maybe like
Hmm.
Tucker Carlson and some of these people flirting with Russia and flirting with this type of thinking.
I find it remarkable that Tucker Carlson did I just a great deal of PR work for Vladimir Putin, and
Yeah,
then Alexei Navalny mysteriously passed away in
yeah.
prison. Quite immaculate timing. I think for me, in terms of there's a real intellectual deficit in on the British political right. There's no two
You
ways
mentioned that
about it.
last time. Could you break that
Yeah.
down for you? What does it
So
mean?
I think for me, I'll tell you what it is. I see such a lack of talk about the things that I think authentic conservatives want to hear. There's a lack of emphasis on the importance of family in
Hmm.
society more generally. I think that just talking about family, community, um, tradition. I'll give you an example. There have been so many identitarian cultural attacks on the British countryside, for example. It seems like every other day there's a report on what the countryside is
Racist.
exclusionary, is very hostile towards ethnic
Yeah.
minorities.
I
Uh,
actually live in the countryside, and honestly, I don't want to go back to London. That's how good it is.
well, I listen. Listen. If I'm a social cohesion expert and I wanted to focus on social disruption, right? And relations which are not necessarily harmonious. Am I going to look at a rural area, or am I going to more likely to look at South London?
Of course, yeah.
Going to look at South London. So, what was interesting, hardly any Conservative politicians even didn't even attempt to defend the countryside from all these identitarian cultural attacks, which are happening
Mhm.
time and again. So I just don't understand what even these modern conservatives what they stand for. I really don't. Quite, and you have the kind of conservative side they just talk about the market, like the market is God. In a
Yep.
sense, it's all that they care about. They have such an uncritical view of the market, and then you have some conservatives who for me, they're just uh, they're also obsessed with the United States in a way. You see a lot of this kind of, there's a certain elements which are quite obsessed with Donald Trump, bizarrely, and then you have some other bands of conservatives who are quite obsessed with like the likes of Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example. Where
Mm.
the sort of politics, the sort of right wing politics of Central Europe. And so I think what it is that they're unable to cultivate an uplifting and positive conservatism, which is rooted in the UK. They keep on looking elsewhere for their inspiration. And I think that's what really taps into that grave intellectual deficit on both sides, that they try to draw these ideas. Many of these ideas aren't very good from outside the UK and they import it into Britain.
Why can't they look within themselves? I mean, this is something which I don't understand. You have a wealth of history in this country.
I couldn't agree more. I could, words fail me. I think that some conservatives, some so-called conservatives, are actually deeply insecure about their Britishness.
Okay, let's see. This is a quite an interesting thing you've mentioned. Why are they? Where does it
No
come from?
idea. No, I don't, I mean, it's just there's an insecurity over Britain's colonial past.
I
Even
see.
even though
Okay.
I'd have to say this might be quite controversial for me to say, but I think Britain had a fair. I'd say that the British Empire was a fairly liberal one compared to some of the
Mm.
other European colonial empires.
Compared to, exactly, compared to. Yeah.
Exactly, absolutely. And listen, Britain learnt from the more brutal aspects of its own colonial endeavours, and the late Queen Elizabeth II, she spearheaded that process of empire to Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth is now a voluntary association of nations. Primarily consists of countries that Britain colonized,
Yeah.
and I think it says a lot that you have countries that were colonized by other European powers who are now members of the Commonwealth, like Mozambique, a former Portuguese colony. You have like countries such as Togo and Gabon, former French colonies.
So they joined
Namibia,
our Commonwealth.
yeah. So they're in the Commonwealth of Nations. I think Namibia is a member of the Commonwealth. That's a former German
How does that
colony.
work?
Um, Rwanda is a former Belgian colony that is also a member of the Commonwealth.
Can you explain to me how that works? Isn't
Well,
that
it works because they're clear. These countries they don't necessarily have good relationships with their former their
Ah,
former the former colonial powers that used to
interesting?
rule over them, and they've always seen. Well, Britain seems to have quite a good relationship with the countries that it colonized. They've actually made an effort to rebuild those ties in a voluntary association of nations, be positive partners based on trade, security, and all the rest of it. And I even hear that Suriname, which is a former Dutch colony,
Dutch, yes.
has aspirations to join the
Bro,
Commonwealth in the future as well.
we need to do a Brexit on the on the former. I'm sorry. If you weren't part of our colonies, you can't join. This is this is not
No,
unacceptable.
I think we have a difference of
I'm just
opinion.
joking.
I think it's a good bit of soft power, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
I
I'm
think
just
it's a good
messing
bit
with
of
you.
soft power that you have former colonies that were former French colonies actually being part of the Commonwealth. I think that
It's
really
okay, French.
tells.
We'll adopt your children. Okay, they like us more. I'm their new daddy. Okay, okay.
But I think it really shows that some of those former European colonial powers that they haven't been able to rebuild those ties with the countries that they previously colonized. But the
Interesting.
UK has taken a more positive and has been more successful in terms of renewing those bonds with countries they had previously colonized. And I think the late Queen had a great deal to do with that.
That's so interesting. I never even knew that was a thing that you can join someone else's former. That is credible. Okay, so and I've just got a comment here because we were talking about like this insecurity of conservatives. So
Mm,
we got it's irritating when people on the right do that. Why look abroad when you've got Edmund Burke, Benjamin Disraeli, Lord Salisbury,
absolutely.
Roger Scruton?
Absolutely. There's such the wealth of conservative philosophers that it's just, why on earth would you possibly draw inspiration from elsewhere? Well and truly, it's just it's remarkable, and I think the thing is, if you talk to young conservative activists, young Tory activists, I'd be interested to know how much of the sort of traditional conservative literature that they read, philosophical
Mm.
literature. I bet very few have, actually, and I think it really tells you something. We have such a wealth of conservative philosophers, British conservative philosophers, that you have people who are more obsessed with what's going on in the United States in the Republican Party. It's truly, truly remarkable. And I think you also, and you something that you mentioned earlier, that British traditions, history, heritage, and much.
We invented this, bro. We invented conservatism. All this stuff is from us. We are the original OG daddy of this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I just think that it's so. How can you lack such imagination that you have all these sort of organic resources to
for real.
cultivate a very special, yeah, a sort of renewed conservatism, which is very much reflective of the times that you live in, but in a sense, drawing on those traditions,
Yeah.
the heritage. I find it unbelievable.
I'm gonna push you even further. You want controversy? Someone said, as controversial as he was and still is, Enoch Powell is someone to look at, as he identified many of the major issues facing the country today, particularly immigration, Europe, and devolution. What are your thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, I mean, listen, Powell supported the repatriation of ethnic and racial minorities from the UK, and he did ultimately predict that the UK would descend into a race war. I don't think that we've descended into a race war. In fact, I think we're a relatively successful multiracial democracy. I think the kind of things that are destabilizing that is the aggressive importation of American-inspired racial identity politics. Um, I think in terms of listen, in terms of immigration, what's happened is that we're now seeing unprecedented scales of inward migration, and I don't think we have a truly robust integration program. And I think that has created serious problems. There's just no two ways about that. But I think overall, the figures in the past, they were deeply skeptical of ethnic minority people's ability to integrate. And I'm not saying that there are not issues surrounding
Mm,
integration; they absolutely are. Um, but I think in a way, the real issue here is that many people are talking about, integration, immigration, the flaws of diversity, cultural diversity, and all the rest of it. Uh, when you see a lot of so-called conservative critiques of where modern Britain is going wrong, a family breakdown never even features in much of this
no,
commentary. It
it's
doesn't
true.
feature, and I think it's a very big problem. You cannot blame the loss of community spirit on migrants.
No,
There's certain things you just can't blame immigrants for. You can't blame immigrants for the fact that now a majority of babies are born outside of wedlock, and these are
no.
these are very serious
Complete non
problems.
sequitur. It's a complete non sequitur.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is, and loneliness among the elderly. I'll be absolutely honest with you. I do think there's a tendency in significant elements of the mainstream. The moment a relative becomes you have an elderly relative enters old age, they may have a disability. At the earliest opportunity, they're looking to shift them into a care
Mm.
home. Let's be absolutely clear that there's certain ethnic minorities, that ethnic and racial,
Impossible.
they just
Impossible.
they
It's
will try
unimaginable.
absolutely everything to avoid
Yeah.
that kind of outcome.
Yeah.
They'll do
No,
everything they
it's
can.
just
They'll
not going to
try
happen.
almost to pool resources and pool their energies to maintain that individual
At their
in a
own
mod
mental
of within
well-being,
family care.
financial cost, everything,
Absolutely.
everything.
Absolutely. So let's be absolutely clear. I'm known to have very conservative views on immigration, integration, social cohesion, and public security more generally. But I think that we need to have a very serious debate about cultural assimilation. What are you asking people to assimilate into? I mean, do you
Mm.
really want people to absorb themselves into these kind of cultural practices, which I think are wholly undesirable in the mainstream?
You know what it is. You're absolutely right. I think when you don't stand for something positive, not just passive. We've been quite passive, like a
Mm,
very passive brand of British, like, oh
yeah,
well, I guess you guys can just figure out yourselves, or I guess
yeah,
yeah, I guess we are racist, and like this passiveness, you know, is actually so unattractive. It is
it
so
is. It's
unattractive, both from the
unappealing.
left and the
It's
right. Yes,
unappealing. There's a lack
it's
of
completely,
assertiveness. It's a
yeah.
lack of assertiveness, and
But the
and
thing is, yeah, go on. Sorry, go on.
and what it is, it's just we're world leader when it comes to providing anti-discrimination protections on the grounds of race, ethnicity, religion, all the rest of it. We're also world leader when it comes to family breakdown. What do we
Mm,
focus more on? Racial equality.
yeah,
You know, this is a
yeah,
joke, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. I think you know what it is. The reason I guess this is, you can correct me if I'm wrong. The reason why some people on the right, whether the
Mm,
UK or some people in the right, some people on the right in the UK like Donald Trump, or some people
mm,
in the right in the US like a Putin, is because they are assertive. They don't care,
mm,
even when they're wrong. They don't care,
yeah.
and they're like, "Wow, this man can actually say what he believes, even when he's stupid. He says it with so much confidence. That's
Mm.
attractive." So
No,
the
I agree.
answer, so the answer is confidence and self-belief, and that's something
Yeah,
that we've completely
there is,
lost on the right.
and don't get me wrong. I mean, Trump with his American, America
Yeah,
first agenda. A lot of people find that appealing. You know, you put your nation state first. You prioritize your own
I,
country.
I guess they just want to vote for someone or stand behind someone who's sure of themselves, rather
Sure of
than
themselves, and they believe
I
in
think I'm
Britain.
the right
Yeah,
person, and I think this country's not that bad. It's like, well, I don't want you as my leader then.
yeah.
You know?
No, no, absolutely. And I think if you look on the left and right, there's a clear lack of political leadership. More
Mm,
generally, let's be absolutely clear. I think next election, we're presented ultimately as a choice between Sir Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. I mean,
mm.
that's a dire situation for me. Let's be absolutely clear. I thought Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn was
Corbyn.
bad. I don't think this is actually a much. There's not a huge improvement. It's not a huge improvement at all.
No.
I think for me, what it is that we have a British political establishment. They're very, how do I describe it? They're very international in their outlook. In the sense that they like going to these international conferences, they like the status that comes with it. I think that actual that genuine sense of national pride. Okay, how many of these politicians that we've talked about, they could confidently
Mm,
talk about British history and heritage even for half an hour?
yeah, yeah.
I don't think that many. If I'm being truthfully honest, and I think that's a serious problem. In order to be a successful political leader, I think one of the main qualities is that you have a great deal of affection for your own country's history, heritage, and traditions.
I think that's something
I
which
think
most people, especially the left, definitely don't have. But on the
I think
right,
it's an
if
important
they do,
quality.
they hide it. If they
They
do,
hide it, or they're not confident enough in terms of
no.
defending that history and heritage. And I think, quite frankly, if you're not confident enough to do that, you shouldn't be in politics. If
I'm gonna what do you want to call it? Go one step further. And this again, I'm not an academic. I'm just a guy on
Mm,
YouTube. Okay, so you can rip into me if you want. But I really think this come like like we're in the what do you want to call it? In the aftermath of this white guilt from
mm,
colonialism and slavery and all this kind of stuff. And listen, not every, most countries in the world had empires or colonies or had
mm,
slaves and did bad things. Like everyone played their part in this game. Okay, no one is completely
mm,
whatever, has no blood on their hands, so on and so forth. Um, However, I think the Christian idea of sort of being like this sort of like
Mm,
original sin
mm,
has now become white guilt. And when you say lack of confidence,
yeah,
it's this like we started this, we were responsible for all of the slavery, for all the colonialism, for all the racism and discrimination and Jim Crow, everything that's bad in the world comes from us. And I think even if they are secular, they still hold this framework in their head,
yeah.
which is, and for some reason, this Western mind can't get over this thing. They really
It
can't.
can't. It can't. It can't. And I think I find white guilt to be such an utterly cringeworthy phenomenon.
Well, for me, white guilt is just basically a secular version of original sin. It's
Oh,
like
it's just ridiculous. And I think another thing is that I think there's a lack of confidence in actually appreciating Britain's Christian traditions
Mm,
and heritage as well, and that includes the British political left. To be fair, and for me, it's the kind of thing where we can have a debate in terms of the role of faith in society, the importance of it, the impact of it. But one thing that's very clear is that there has been a decline in Christian identification over the last 20 years. It's been quite sharp decline as well. But that nothing really meaningful has replaced it.
no.
You know, you've had this rapid and that drop in Christian. I find, yeah, I'll tell you what I find even more hilarious is that many people said, "Oh, it must be because of mass immigration that
No,
Christian
no, no, no,
identification
no, no, no.
has
This is something
declined in Britain."
independent of, yes.
Well, I'd even argue that in some cases, it's newly arrived migrants keeping Christianity on life support in certain urban parts of
Like you were saying,
England.
the African
Well,
people.
listen, like whether it's sort of Nigerian Protestants in Croydon or Polish Catholics in Ealing, and then you have yeah, you have Filipinos, you have Goans, you have Orthodox Romanians. So actually, more than anything, I'd actually argue you're seeing a changing face of Christianity in
Mm.
Britain, where there's that sort of re-energization process is being spearheaded by migrants, whether they're from the European Union or from Commonwealth member states such as Nigeria, Ghana, India, and other Asian countries such as the Philippines. So I think what's really interesting here is that the political right's relationship with Christianity is not in a very good condition.
No.
In my view, you have people who, Christianity is informed much of the way our society is organized. Our systems are organized in a sense, and I think some people just to do away with it, as if it's some kind of embarrassing relative. Or this is had its use now. I think it's a crying shame, actually.
Well, the thing is, if you're going to get rid of something, then you better have a bloody good thing to replace it with. And
When
they
and
haven't done
we'll,
anything.
they haven't replaced it, and I
No,
think a lot of people say that sort of they term it wokeism. Um, it's not a very satisfying ideology.
no.
I mean, can you? Faith can protect for many people. It can be a source of optimism, resilience, determination,
Community.
community, sense of belonging, purpose. Wokeism will never give you that.
No.
It just couldn't possibly give you that. Ultimately, any politics which is rooted in kind of victimhood and grievance is over. That's not. It's not going to liberate an individual, is it?
No.
It's not going to be liberating. It's not going to be a source of. Um, it's not going to be a source of good feeling and positivity, in my view.
No, I'm with you on that. And I think so if we now go back to, like you were saying, either whether it's those certain Muslim groups that look at
Mm,
secular people and think you guys have children outside of wedlock, you got so many problems, you got no
mm,
community, you put your old people in old
mm.
people homes.
You think a biological male can be a
Right,
woman?
you think a man is a woman, you think all these things. What exactly am I integrating into?
Mm.
Right? Or like,
Exactly, that's what it is. I think this is my view. I think the majority of British Muslims are anti-Islamist, but they're very socially conservative.
yeah.
I think that's what it is. So I think the issue is that many of them they find the sort of radical Islamism quite off-putting, if truth be told, and they're actually quite happy just to live their life, look after their families, serve their families, and enjoy British
Mm.
democracy. but I think they would find elements of mainstream culture unappetizing and
Yeah.
unappealing, and they would be right to think that. Um, so I think that what's really interesting for me is that British Muslims are some of the most socially conservative people in the country, right? The Conservative Party performs very poorly with British Muslims at the
Terrible.
ballot box. Absolutely, it's a terrible performance, time and again. Um, and I think that uh, because I think that it's very likely that we're going to have a Labour government soon. I think that the British political right has to think about how does it engage with British Muslims more generally. And I think that kind of talk that we were referring to earlier, that there's been some kind of Islamist takeover of Britain. I mean, I think that we can talk about Islamist extremism and take that threat seriously without indulging in that kind of alarmism. So I think moving forwards, more generally, the British political right, it has to think about how it performs better in urban England. How does it do better in the cities? For example, where you have some of the most traditional minded families in the
Mm,
country. And I think that there needs to be a very serious discussion about how the British political life views Islam's place in modern Britain. And I'm not saying they need to romanticize it, not at all. But I think that they need to take a more nuanced view of the role of faith more generally in society. And I think they need to look how do they build strong relations with a variety of voters? Because at the moment they're running out of people who actually genuinely think that
yeah.
the Conservative Party is a force for good.
No, no. I would say it's become completely impotent. And the
Impotence
only
good term,
reason,
yeah.
yeah, the only reason why they're in power is because their opposition is, well, rogue.
Dire.
Yeah,
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 it's
yeah.
diabolical, and I think that it's just remarkable that we've got to the stage where the Labour Party is more trusted on immigration than the Conservatives.
Hmm.
It's totally remarkable.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Rakib, and it's been a fascinating. I think we've nearly been on for 90 minutes. We've covered
Yeah, we
quite a
have
lot of
been.
things.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we should look out for? Just very quickly, looking forward now. We spent our time talking about all these different things and how we've
Mhm.
got here. If you were to have your what do you call it? Oh, I forgot what you call it. There's that ball where you look in the future. Um,
Well, Mystic Meg,
Mystic Meg, right? If you had that kind of ball, right? If you had that kind
crystal ball,
what
crystal ball.
crystal ball, that's there we go. Yeah. What trends should we be
Oh,
looking
listen,
for in the future?
I think firstly people have to. I think one thing people need to see Britain as a force for good on the whole. I think that's
Mm,
something that means a great deal to me. And I think that when we talk about ethnic minority, we need to stop engaging with individuals who are ultimately self-serving, self-appointed, and they're not really representative of the communities that they supposedly belong to. I think we need to end that. I think we really do have to end that the toxic model of community engagement. Um, I, it comes as no surprise that I really think that we need to have a more family centered social agenda, social policy agenda. I think we need to do away with obsessions over race and other protected characteristics. And I think we also need to recognize we still live in a fairly stratified society. I think those class-based barriers remain, and I think we need to find ways in terms of giving young working class people greater economic, social, and cultural opportunities, irrespective of their background. Um, but truthfully, if you're talking about which group of young people may feel particularly marginalised, probably white working class
yeah.
lads, to be honest. And
No one wants
many,
to hear them cry. No one wants.
yeah,
Yeah.
and many hail, many live in communities which are, many of the civic assets there are completely hollowed out. They don't exist anymore. There's been a real loss of community spirit. Many come from family backgrounds which are anything but stable. But quite often they're portrayed as hyper privileged by virtue of
Mm,
being white and male. And I think we really need to get away from that toxic line of thinking. And again, I think much of that's imported from the sort of, deeply divisive race politics in the US. And I think most of all, I really want to see a politics which just focuses on doing the bread and butter quite well, like the basic responsibilities of the state, making sure that your national borders are functioning accordingly. Sort of improving the skills of young people, making sure that we have a healthcare system which is not bursting at the seams. I think things like that, we need to focus more on the bread and butter of governance. And I think we need to do away with, many politicians, they have these obsessions with vanity projects and virtue signaling. And I think that that's something that really holds Britain back. And I think most of all, I think even conversations like the one we've had, where we've touched upon a variety of topics, people need to understand that you disagree with someone, that doesn't make that other person evil.
Mm.
I think that's a big thing. We live in very polarized times. And I think that through good faith and positive engagement, I think at least trying to understand the other person's point of view can go a long way in terms of shoring up our democratic society.
Yeah, no, I'm 100% with you. It seems like family first. That's what it seems like. All
Yeah,
these problems, a lot of these could be actually prevented, right? We
agreed.
wouldn't even need to be talking about half the stuff that's coming.
Yeah, I'd like the government to give less money to so-called racist justice charities and maybe give it to more grassroots advocates who spread a positive message based
Mm,
on family and marriage.
family and marriage. Awesome. And again, conservative values. It would be nice if a conservative actually showed something that's conservative.
Indeed,
God forbid they assert themselves on something as basic, as basic evolutionary biological as that. Family, for God's sake,
exactly.
right? Even left wingers people have families, believe it or not. Yeah, something
Indeed.
we can all unite around. But Rakib, if people want to find you, where are you on Twitter, on YouTube? Where are you?
So to my Twitter handle is RAKIBEHSAN. And if they want to delve into my thoughts more deeply on the kind of issues that we discussed, they do have the option of purchasing Beyond Grievance on Amazon as Amazon
Beyond
Prime, so you
grievance on
probably
ground.
get delivery.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you so much for that. Um, on Instagram, I don't know if you push people to go on there because you are a very good chef, as your pictures
I am. So I've got a food account as well. It's the Spice Meister account.
the spice
There's not been any new posts on there recently.
Okay,
That was more of a kind of just something to do during my PhD, really, a kind of release. But I do love
absolutely
food. I do
awesome.
love making South Asian dishes in particular when I
That's
have
it,
the
man.
time.
That's it. Keeping the tradition live and well.
Indeed.
None of this keto shito that I've been on. But there you go. Rakib, bro, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure as always. I felt like
No,
we've covered so much ground. We've really got deep into it. We've kind of really
indeed.
kind of got beyond the sort of superficial talking points and really got deep into it.
Absolutely. No, no, no.
And
And listen, thank you for having me. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
as always, bro, as always, we should probably do this soon in person, hopefully.
Absolutely. I'll be
That
up
would
for
be
that.
really, really good. But thank you everyone for watching, for listening, for commenting, for asking questions. I'm sure you'll see more Rakib on all the major TV stations and of course in the major print as well. So thank you for Rakib for coming on again, and I'll see you guys next time.
Thank you for having me.